On behalf of President Turner and Associate Dean Bill Dillon, representing the Cox School, I'd like to welcome you. This is a wonderfully collaborative effort. Thanks also to Meadows board member Nancy Nasher and to the Nasher Sculpture Center for hosting us and this panel this evening. If anyone was in doubt that Dallas is committed to the arts and to its arts organizations, this gathering would be a resounding answer to that. It might perhaps have something to do with the catchy title we gave this afternoon, and that we might also be aware of some of the pressures facing the arts today. But I believe that you are here today for a moment in history. You will be able to say you were here at the announcement of something very, very special that will change the way that we do business in the arts in Dallas and in America. This is a chance for SMU to give back to our community, to be a resource. You've known for years about our program in arts management, and now, as I think all of you know, it's very, very ably led by the amazing Zannie Voss, who has become a fixture all over Dallas. In fact, I've had more than one conversation with Zannie about, I have too many phone calls. Everybody wants a piece of me. So yes, that's what happens when you're great, and when you're doing something that's being recognized by the city. So this is an amazing connection. Today we have lots of connections across the city, people who are working on one project or another, or who have been connected through Zannie or through the Meadows Foundation or through one of our board members. So I want to thank all of you for your attention, your dedication to the arts, and for being here today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Zannie Voss, who will introduce our panel. Zannie.
Thank you, Dean Bowen. I've got a friend that starts off every phone call, instead of saying hello, says, "So, what can you tell me?" And even though that always puts me on the spot to want to feel kind of pithy, and I don't do that very well, I realize that that's really the primary fundamental question that we ask of data. So what can you tell me? You know, we'd all like to have our intuitions confirmed when they're on target. Data can help us do that. We'd also all like to have more information when our intuitions would have otherwise taken us on a path to disaster, to know ahead of time based on information, on evidence. And we can learn from facts, we can learn from evidence about what works, about what to avoid, and about where the opportunities lie. And that's really what's behind today's discussion of ending guesswork, of using data to foster thriving arts organizations. And so I've asked some incredible colleagues to join us here today, and I'd like to introduce each of them to you. I'm going to start on the end. I've got Rick Lester, who is the founder and the CEO of TRG Arts. To his left is Rebecca Thomas, Vice President of Nonprofit Finance Fund. Kate Levin, the Commissioner for the City of New York's Department of Cultural Affairs. Anita Contini, the lead of Arts and Culture for Bloomberg Philanthropies. Glen Howard, who is not only the chair of the board of the Cultural Data Project, he is also the managing director for legal affairs and general counsel for Pew Charitable Trusts. And directly to my right is Kevin Moore, who is the managing director of Theater Communications Group. Each of these has an incredibly lengthy bio and many accomplishments, and rather than take our discussion time, I'm going to encourage you to please read about them in the program. You have some more information about them there. And rather than ask everybody to just sort of speak in monologue for 10 minutes on the topic, I really would like to have a discussion. And that means I would like to ask you, when you have an idea and you would like to pose a question, to please do so, to respond to the questions as well as responding to one another. And to ensure that what we talk about here today was really relevant to those of you here in the audience, we asked you to submit your responses to the question of what questions do you have about your organization's practices that you think data could help answer. And I thought maybe we'll get 10 responses. We wound up with over 50 responses. We won't get to all 50 questions today, but what you will hear is kind of the resonance of those questions kind of thematically linked. But if we're not addressing something that you'd like to hear about, to please go ahead and jump in. You guys ready? we're going to start, I'd like to start with a couple of related questions around the topic of sustainability. So kind of big picture. One of the questions was, can we gather data that will help us create a more sustainable business model? And relatedly, how can data help improve our overall sustainability and growth and help develop financial sustainability? So do you guys have any thoughts either about data that you've encountered or knowledge that's emerged from findings that could shed a little bit of light on how can data and database findings help to create sustainability? Rebecca.
Yeah.
Since I work at the Nonprofit Finance Fund, I'll start with this question. I think I like to start by saying that I don't think data in and of itself leads to financial sustainability. Ultimately, it is data-driven decision-making that contributes to nonprofit financial health. My feeling is that actually the nonprofit sector is awash in financial data, but that we all too frequently misapply it, misinterpret it, and unfortunately sometimes even ignore it altogether. So when we're consulting with our clients or lending to our borrowers, we really focus on, I would say, two questions that pertain to nonprofit sustainability. The first is your organization or the organization that you support operating at consistent surplus year in and year out? Or stated another way, is our revenue, both earned and contributed, reliably covering the full cost of doing business? Because ultimately that's the first step towards a sustainable business model. And the second question is, does our organization or does the organization that we support have an appropriately liquid and flexible balance sheet? Do we have enough cash on hand to be able to manage the cyclicality of the day-to-day business, as well as to be able to periodically adapt and change when circumstances demand it? I don't believe that there's really an end point or an arrival point. You don't sort of get to sustainability and declare victory. It's really about having the capacity to adapt and change as circumstances demand.
So in a world that's awash in data, how do you know what numbers to look at and which numbers you can ignore?
It's a great question. We focus a lot on the bottom line of the income statement and the bottom line of the balance sheet. So we look for evidence of surpluses over time. And then we back into what are the major contributors of those surpluses, both on the earned income and the contributed income side.
So is there one set of right numbers other than just end the year in the black?
Yes, so I would...
That's my last question.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't think the answer is get to break even or get to surplus. I think for every organization, the amount of cash that they require on hand is going to be radically different. An organization with a big new facility is going to require reserves to manage that facility, to take care of it as it ages and depreciates. A very small organization may only need a few weeks, a month, 2 months of cash because it doesn't have the same level of complexity. So I really tend to steer clear of one-size-fits-all metrics and focus on what does your organization need to be able to adapt and change and innovate and take risk.
Yeah. Glen?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Rebecca that we're awash in data and that data is only a tool for informing that fact-based decision making. So if you're going to rely on it to make decisions, it has to be reliable. It has to be high quality. You have to be able to depend on it. And so collecting data in a thorough way, in a comprehensive way, in a high quality way where you have error checking, where you have the ability to make sure that what you're getting is you can rely on to inform your decisions to me, is key. And then two other aspects of this is that just looking at data, a snapshot is very nice at the end of the year. Yeah, you want to be black, not red. But if you want to, knowing where you've been helps to inform where you're going and whether you can be sustainable. So looking at your historic data and collecting it over time so that you can look at trends, you can compare how you've been doing, where you're allocating your resources, where you're getting a return on investment, whether it's in outreach or in marketing or in fundraising. You need to collect it over time in order to do that. And as far as comparing yourself over time, that's very helpful. But the next component is also making sure that you know where you stand in sort of the ecology of the arts sector, both in your neighborhood and perhaps in your state or across the country. So being able to to look at data that has been collected in the same way that you have and compare it to like organizations or perhaps unlike organizations is also a key, I think, to be able to inform decision-making towards sustainability.
I would love to. You know, sometimes I think that when you're talking about the arts and research, that there is a perception that they're sort of antithetical to one another. You know, art is all about the heart and emotion, and certainly what we put in our stages and what we create is certainly about that emotion. But the arts, sustainable arts, has to be a business. It has to be a business, and so the research portion of this, you know, is so vitally important, because one of the things that I think that data actually does is when you have a lot of stakeholders like we do in our businesses, staff, board, audience. I mean, the audience is huge. You have, the data provides, at least with the stakeholders that you're working with in making decisions, staff and board, it provides a common ground. It's no longer up for opinion. You know, it's not subjective anymore. This is where we are, folks. This is what we've got, and this is what we have to do something about. And it really levels the playing field, I think, so that we are dealing with facts instead of just opinions.
And just as a follow-up, more towards that first question, have any of you come across through your research or through working with organizations on their own data, information that's led to creation of new business models, of sort of changing the way organizations operate, based on what you found? Anita?
I could talk a little bit about that. There's a really great example. The Alvin Ailey Dance Company, which you know about quite well, Rebecca, did a really remarkable thing with data. They actually see it as a resource. And after they built their new building and had raised a tremendous amount of money, they were wondering what next. And they didn't really realize how to get through that. So some help from the Not-for-Profit Finance Fund and from the Doris Duke Foundation, they came up with a very clever program. They actually looked inside their organization to decide how they were going to grow their organization. And data was really key. And what they actually did was they looked at all of their businesses, which was programs for performing both locally and internationally. They looked at their shop, they looked at their classes, they looked at every single thing that they did. And they realized they had 10 different data systems, all individually supported. And they were going, oh my God. And then they realized that with some support, they could put those all together and create one data system and also run a metrics with it. And because of that, they were able to increase their earned income by $1 million. And they now use it in a way in which they can tell everything about anybody who goes on to their, I should maybe back up and say they connected their whole social media program with their website and with their data systems, all connected together. So now that they can tell if you go in and take a class, they'll know that you've logged into the class. They'll also know if you're a patron. They'll know everything about you, and they can actually tailor all their letters to you or their information to you so that they have complete information about the users and about what the users care about. And so they have an extremely important resource, which is data. And they didn't really realize that in the beginning, and now it's become a tremendous program where they originally had in their classes about 400 or 500 students, I think, if I'm correct, and now they have 50,000. So, and their income also increased triple because of it. So I think that it's an amazing thing that you don't think about data as a resource.
I guess the one example I'd offer, because it's on a much smaller scale, so you don't have to be a behemoth to benefit from this. We have a couple of small theater companies in New York that realized their biggest problem was a sort of binge and purge cycle on ticket sales. And particularly with, certainly in New York after 9/11, one of the things that didn't recover was subscription purchases. And there's sort of a big, scary, weird zeitgeist, I think, story to tell around that. But the bottom line is you don't know how many people are showing up tonight. Are you going to be 40% full or 100%? And a number of small theater companies realized that they had an opportunity to start selling tickets at 4 o'clock on any given day through social media, because they had a whole potential audience that was going to be deciding between a movie, a jazz club, going out to dinner, and they needed to slot themselves into that frame of reference rather than a traditional theater. You sell by ads, you sell by subscriptions, you sell by something associated with a more traditional performing arts marketing mechanism. And so being able to isolate what the problem was by understanding their own data streams and then being able to address it and forge much stronger connections to audience members. And again, these are relatively small houses, 100 seats, 150 seats, makes a huge, huge difference, and at very little cost. Cost of labor, cost of really smart folks paying attention and doing the programming, but you're not purchasing advertising.
Kind of feeding off of that, something else?
I was going to say, we worked with, a few years ago, worked with a couple of very small theater companies in Central City, Philadelphia, who were having difficulty attracting people late at night to come downtown into a scary neighborhood. And they asked us if we could take their data, geocode the data, and blow the data back onto SEPTA maps, the Southeast Pennsylvania Regional Transit Authority maps. And with that data, they were able to successfully go and lobby the people who run the transit authority to change train schedules and to add trains to the schedule, timed for people to be able to come from the burbs into Central City, Philadelphia, have dinner, or arrive just in time for a curtain, and then there are trains waiting to take them home. The train people sold more tickets, the theaters sold more tickets, and it was entirely a data-driven kind of process that had nothing with doing good for the arts or doing good for the community. It was doing good business based on data, not guesswork.
Thinking about the smaller organizations, are many of you here today from small arts organizations? Number of hands going up. We had a couple of questions specifically related to small arts organizations. One said, is data really only for big organizations?
No.
Okay. The next question was...
Does that satisfy the question?
On to the next question.
If anything, it may be even more important for smaller organizations than for larger ones. The small organizations that can't afford to have perhaps a high-priced CFO or to put together sophisticated financial statements that funders want to see. I mean, smaller organizations are fighting for the very same pieces of the pie as everybody else. I'm not telling you something you don't know. But you have to work harder, to put it crassly, to defend your existence. And while it's great to have terrific stories about the quality of your work, in small organizations, I was just saying, I saw something great at a small theater in DC the other night, a stage around this side, but it was really high quality work and great stories to be told about it. But the stories itself is not enough. And if they can't come forward and show what kind of return on investment their funders are getting and defending their right to exist and competing on the basis of actual data and not just anecdote, then they're not going to last very long. It really does take the two.
You know, there's another thing that we actually support about 245 very small and mid-sized arts organizations. I'd say 70% have budgets under $3 million, and most of them have budgets under $500,000. So they're fairly small. But what's really interesting, we collect a lot of data on how they're doing, and we feed that right back to them because we know that it's really important for them to take it to their funders and take it to their board to show that they can actually maybe get more resources, get additional funding. We did this a number of times, and one that was really interesting was the use of social media, because so many young and small organizations really don't have enough resources to hire staff for social media. So we did a whole study on that, and we realized that 89% of our grantees actually increased their earned income and audience due to the opportunity to learn about social media and actually using it and reducing their advertising costs in a traditional format. So we gave that to them, and it was very interesting to see how many of them were able to take that back to their boards and to their funders and to increase their support and resources.
2 really quick points. Yeah. If you don't collect the data, you got no data. And so you have to be obsessive about collecting data. And collecting data, point number 2, does not mean getting an email address. You may not be using direct mail, but without that snail mail address, you deny yourself, you deny your organization to use all of the next generation tools of predictive modeling that you can't use if all you have is a dumb email address. A dumb email address can't be matched to anything. Snail mail address can be matched to everything.
The one thing that I wanted to say, well, two things that I wanted to say is, first of all, you know, I would suspect that everyone that works at an arts organization in some way, shape, or form does research. I mean, you know, you do research. When you decide on a season or something like that, you ask your cohorts what they think of this or how did this show do, you know, at your theater or whatever. However, I think that the more disciplined that research can be, the better. And there are sources out there right now. For instance, one is at Theater Communications Group. If you're a TCG member and you fill out our fiscal survey, we do a huge fiscal survey every year. And all of that data is out there for you to use if you're a TCG member. And there are other places like this, that there is data out there that you can actually access to compare your theater or your arts organization to the world. And it's very, very important, helpful.
Relatedly to small organizations, a question that was asked is, so we don't have a lot of staff to allocate to this. We don't necessarily have the in-house knowledge. If we had to look at some key metrics, what would they be? You know, whether it's marketing efficiency, staff efficiency, what is it we should be looking at a very basic level? Any suggestions?
I guess my biggest plea is that every organization should figure out what's important to them and what relates to their mission. There's no one size fits all. I mean, and I think it's partly the state of social science. I mean, my analogy of the moment is it's kind of like fission. You know, scientists can't see it, but they know from the byproducts whether or not it's happened. And I think that's where we are in this field, because you can't measure quality, you can't measure transformation. We don't have the turkey baster we can stick in people's brains yet to, you know, sort of see the glorious work that, you know, we all believe happens in conjunction with amazing art. But every organization has some set of metrics that's really core to its reason for existing, and that's fine. And, you know, it can be that the parking lot across the street fills up when you're open, right. Or it can be, you know, a metric about the kind of employment or ancillary employment your activities trigger. Or one of my favorite things in New York City, I torture my staff all the time about telling me how much in office supplies cultural organizations purchase citywide. You know, I want the paper clips. I want to be able to claim victory. But, you know, so there are lots of different number stories organizations can tell, and sometimes the really unique ones. We had one organization that was the biggest purchaser of hot dogs and hamburgers made in the 5 boroughs of New York, and then they switched to an out-of-state purveyor, so that sort of blew that one. But, you know, some of these indicators can actually be great just because they are so specific to an organization. But I think unless you show the discipline and the good faith to try and understand what impact you're having by some kind of data set that's measurable, it makes it tough, because everybody in the arts believes they're on the side of the angels, and, you know, that's a lot of angels to be alongside, so it helps to have data.
That's very true.
It's just not enough.
Right.
I agree, and I would say that the field is moving towards an outcome-driven approach, that if all organizations don't define what success means for them now, others will define success for you, which is not where any of us want to be. I totally agree that with what we've been talking about here, but sometimes I find it helpful to think about measurement in a few different buckets or priority categories. So I would, for example, encourage everyone to think about mission, capital, and capacity. What does this success mean for you from a mission perspective? And you just gave some great examples of metrics in that area. From a capacity perspective, where you might be looking at things like staff productivity, professional development opportunities, what are the infrastructure needs that you have as an organization? And then capital, what are the key financial metrics that are critical to your success? Because I think sometimes, particularly small organizations, can get paralyzed by trying to just measure dozens of different things, and if you can focus on 3 or 4 key strategic areas and then 3 to 5 metrics that fall under each, it can just become a lot more manageable. You can kind of throw them in a dashboard and use that not just internally, but also as a way to talk to your boards of directors and keep them focused.
I think that's really important, what you just said, and that I frankly just learned about this year, I feel like, was measuring mission fulfillment. I think that that's a really important thing, and you know, there was a question somewhere in here about that, and you know, it's really more about, I mean, who you know, it's what your stakeholders believe. You know, that's really the sort of quantifiable thing there by talking to your stakeholders, and if your mission is being fulfilled, then they will express that back to you. Does that make sense? And so it's a really it's a key part, I think, not just of getting data about your mission fulfillment as well as your finances. You know, it's not all about the money. It's a lot about the money, but there are other areas where data can really be helpful.
Kind of you know, thinking about the relevance to artistic mission, and it's a difficult thing to get around when you have a qualitative aesthetic objective of how do you put numbers to it. And there's a struggle, but there's an aspect of programming that we received a question about, which was related more to how much programming should we have out on the market? You know, how do we use data to figure out what capacity? How do we figure out how to use data to help us balance doing innovative works with doing works that are going to be more surefire successes in terms of audience? Have any of you had experience in thinking about data in that way as, you know, useful for understanding capacity and what to put out there?
This is a terrible thing to say, but the organizations I've watched do that, it doesn't tend to work. If you rely on data to figure out your programming, you're kind of sunk. You know, you need to rely on data to understand how much risk you can take, really. You know, what is consistent for your organization? You know, what percentage of fundraising asks are likely to come in at some point in what period of time? And you know, that's really how you start knowing when things are getting off track. Right. And you know it fast enough to be able to take corrective action. But, you know, in other words, if you've done 5 shows and none of them really sold well, you can look at the data and say, maybe I should do 4, or maybe I should do different work. And you know, then the challenge is to really figure out how is it that did these works not reach an audience because they weren't very good, because they weren't marketed aggressively, because there was a snowstorm? You know, what were the reasons behind that issue? But in other words, the use of data to actually drive programming as opposed to analyze what succeeded and how to do better, I think it's an important distinction.
Yeah, but
agree.
Yeah, but I don't disagree about the notion of programming by numbers. If there was a way to turn dumb data into those kind of smart decisions, every Broadway musical would be Book of Mormon, and every movie would be Star Wars, and wouldn't we all be happy? And you know, every Broadway show would make money as opposed to a small percentage. But we just had a client in our shop 2-3 weeks ago, theater company, who came in and said, you know, we're doing, I think, 4 weeks of each production, and week 1 is really great, week 2 is awful, week 3 is better, and week 4 is terrific. We want to cancel week 2. And they've done the numbers on trying to figure out how do we cancel week 2. And because we're consultants, we said, well, you really can't cancel week 2, and we explained the arithmetic. But you know, one of the ways that facts come into this is that regardless of art form, there's a direct correlation between how many performances you give and what the total number of tickets you're going to sell is likely to be. And if you have been in the business, running your company for a while, you've got data that's going to suggest there's a high and low and median case to be made. And it may be, in some cases, it may be the smart thing to do to try to figure out how to cancel week 2 if, in fact, what you make is less than the operating costs of that week. But in the case of this one, this particular theater company, they actually would have lost more money had they tried to cancel week 2. And it, you know, ultimately became a simple case of arithmetic, trying to figure out how many shows, how many performances should we present. And so, you know, it's not just a straight line. I think that you know, data is really dumb because it can't tell you what's going to happen. You can't prove with data that Star Wars is going to be a big success. There's nothing in the data that says that if you perform a work by Tchaikovsky and have sugar plum fairies dancing on a stage in December that you can make a lot of money if you've never done that before, because the data is all rear view mirror kinds of things. It's really lousy at projecting forward.
One of the questions posed was, what demographics matter? I know I should be segmenting, but on what? And a related question was about, how do I know when I've saturated the market? If everybody who's going to come to this has already bought a ticket, but how do I understand those aspects from the marketing director's side? Is there an answer, kind of one size fits all for important demographics with respect to arts audiences?
We use demographics, but demographics for us is really more of a spice than the entree. Understanding the behaviors of your patrons, those transactions that reside in the ticketing system, the fundraising system, that's customer relationship management system, where you collect all of that stuff, is far more important. And it's far more important from a predictive standpoint to not just know what people are doing when they're with you, but also when you're in your theater, and your symphony orchestra, and your ballet company, because what we know is the more people buy, the more they tend to buy. And creating multi-buyers across an entire arts ecosystem lifts all of the boats. And one of the ways that there are a number of ways you can prove this, but this business of, am I tapped out? Have I just reached everybody? The people who we consistently find see the biggest year-over-year growth are the ones that are closest to being tapped out, or they think. There's always somewhere to go. There's always another segment to tap. There's always a way to dig deeper into those segmentations, particularly when you're collecting the data and you're getting those snail mail addresses, and we get to use all of the new bells and whistles that predict what somebody is likely to do.
Don't you also think that because of social media, it's really increased your opportunity now? Because it's not just the people in your hometown, but there's people in the next town and beyond, so that you can really, you're really never really tapped out totally.
Yeah. Well, you have more opportunities to create relationship with people.
Right.
Because, when I started in this, my ability to create a relationship with people, my patrons in the community, depended upon my ability to convince the music critic to write a feature story about something that the critic didn't want to write about. Well, today, A, those people are gone. And I'm not all that sad.
How do you really feel?
Well, because there are tools today that allow me to go right into somebody's home, right onto their laptop, right into the palm of their hand, and tell my story, because my people want my organization to be successful, and so I have much greater opportunity to create a relationship with them. That's what social media does, I think, more than anything.
Also, if you have a great story, and people don't know they always have great stories.
Oh, yeah.
But everything from a rehearsal to a conversation with somebody is always a great story. It's a way to reach an audience, and it's a way to continue to grow the data about what you're doing.
I think that's why the demographic issue, I found that question kind of troubling, because it made me think, that there was panic out there about trying to, tell funders what they want to hear, or, something like that. And again, what I would come back to is your demographic needs to make good on your mission. If, you're serving seniors, you have to show that you're serving seniors. If you're serving young people, whatever your target audience is, that's the important demographic. And, it's harder if you are a non-ticket based kind of organization. If you're doing arts education, or if you're a museum where you don't necessarily have the same kind of admission gating process. But so then that's the challenge of that particular cultural enterprise, is to figure out how to do that. And one of the things that I think is really smart that a number of organizations are figuring out is that it's not just data collection. Data sounds like it's a high-tech enterprise. Some of the best run and smartest museums in New York have figured out that their security guards are actually their customer relation agents.
Oh, that's
and
right.
they're cross-training them in ways that sometimes is tricky from a labor management point of view. But those are the folks, if someone just stares at you, assumes you're carrying a bomb, and clicks a clicker, not so great. And if you're particularly trying to attract an audience that may cycle right back out if they feel intimidated, that's a real barrier to audience retention. But if you can figure out a way of making that first encounter into something where people feel valued and respected, and all the reasons why you'd bother to leave your house and not just watch TV, that's this really special value proposition cultural organizations have, and figuring out how to take advantage of that and turn those kinds of individuals into your front line of data collection and your front line of your organization's message. I think there's huge potential there.